How's it going, everyone, and welcome to podcast number 9. Today we're going to be talking about the Squad, or the 12 Apostles. So, if you want early access to these podcasts, lads, you can sign up to my Patreon, which I'll have linked below. Other than that, let's get straight into this one. So, for years, I've looked at the Squad, or the 12 Apostles, as a very straightforward group of men. I kind of had the presumption that Michael Collins just picked 12 competent men that he knew well and he trusted, and then those 12 men were the Squad. Pretty simple, right? But is anything in Irish history ever straightforward? Unfortunately not, most of the time. So, the Squad was officially formed in September 1919. Emphasis on officially. But before that, we can trace back the roots to another squad to May 1919. So let's get straight into this. Mick MacDonald was a Wicklow man that fought in Jacob's Biscuit Factory in 1916. He was also detained in Frongach prison camp afterwards. During his time there, he made friends with Michael Collins, and after his release, Mick MacDonald became quartermaster of the 2nd Battalion of the Dublin Brigade IRA. Dick McKee, the brigadier of the Dublin Brigade, asked Mick MacDonald, on behalf of Michael Collins, to shoot the detectives who were responsible for identifying the 1916 Easter Rising leaders who were executed. These detectives were known as the G Division of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, and they were more commonly known as the G-Men. The first G-man that Mick MacDonald targeted was Detective Sergeant Patrick Smith, who was nicknamed the Dog Smith. Detective Smith was known for carrying out numerous raids on the Gaelic press printer Joe Stanley. He was also known for his preconceived notions against Sinn Féin. Smith had also raided 44 Parnell Square in Dublin, where Collins used to often stay. It's possible that he may have known what Collins looked like, which was obviously not ideal. He was notorious for his efforts to track down Michael Collins, and he harassed so many Republicans that he actually became fairly unpopular in his place of employment, the Dublin Metropolitan Police. So let's chat about how Mick MacDonald went about assassinating Detective Smith. First of all, Mick approached his half-brother, Tom Keogh, and then two more 2nd Battalion Dublin IRA men, Jim Slattery and Tom Ennis, and also an IRA intelligence officer by the name of Mick Kennedy. Kennedy knew what Detective Smith looked like, so he was a huge asset to have. So Mick MacDonald asked the 4 men to complete this mission for him. The 4 men waited at Drumcondra Bridge in North Dublin. Detective Smith was known to travel home from Dublin city centre by train. The plan was to ambush him as he got off the train. So after waiting there for a few nights, they finally saw Detective Smith on the 30th of July 1919. They shot him with a .38 revolver. The caliber in the revolver was too small and the bullets didn't actually kill him, and he was able to run as far as his home. Tom Keogh and Jim Slattery ran after him, and they kept firing as he ran into his house. Detective Smith died 5 or 6 weeks later of his bullet wounds on the 8th of September 1919. The men learned there and then that the .38 revolvers were no good. After this lesson, they began to use .45 revolvers instead. A few days later, on the 12th of September, the men killed target number 2, G-Man, Detective Daniel Hoey. Detective Hoey was the G-Man that identified 1916 Easter Riding leader Sean McDermott, and hence he was the reason he got executed in Kilmainham jail. Now this story will show you just how competent the squad were. On the 12th of September, Detective Hoey raided the Sinn Féin office on Harcourt Street in Dublin. During the raid, Hoey was looking through a tray of documents, and an IRA volunteer told him that the last man to pick up that tray was Detective Smith, who had just been buried the previous day. At 10 p.m. that night, Mick MacDonald, Jim Slattery and Tom Ennis spotted Detective Hoey on Townsend Street in Dublin City. This was just outside the G-Man offices on Great Brunswick Street. Hoey was on the way back to the offices and stopped into a shop for a bottle of milk. The squad fired 4 or 5 shots, 3 of which hit him, and his death was instantaneous. These 5 men, Mick MacDonald, Tom Keogh, Jim Slattery, Tom Ennis and Mick Kennedy, formed what was the very beginnings of the squad. Now in September 1919, the squad was officially formed. Vinnie Byrne, who was a very famous member of the squad, said that the first full-time official squad that was paid a wage was made up of himself, Mick MacDonald, Tom Keogh, Jim Slattery, Paddy Daly, Joe Leonard, Ben Barrett, Sean Doyle, Paddy Griffin, Eddie Byrne, Mick Riley and Eddie Conroy. Okay, so there is your 12 apostles. Vinnie Byrne also stated that the 12 apostles was commanded by Mick MacDonald, which makes sense as he was the man that commanded the original squad back when it was formed in May. Now here is where Here is where it gets a little bit confusing, but stay with me for now. The aforementioned squad member, Paddy Daly, argued against this. He said that Mick MacDonald was not even in the squad. It says in some of his witness statements that Michael Collins' full-time squad was made up of Paddy Daly, who was in charge, Tom Keogh, Jim Slattery, Frank Bolster, Mick Kennedy, Eddie Byrne, Vinnie Byrne, Joe Leonard, Ben Byrne, James Conroy and Paddy Griffin. And Mick MacDonald is excluded completely from this list. The conclusion is, it's clear that there were two sections of the squad. One that was led by Mick MacDonald, which generally operated part-time, and these guys were actually working jobs as well at the time. The other section was led by Paddy Daly, and those men worked on a full-time basis and they were paid an actual wage. From time to time, the squad was also helped out and further reinforced by the big four of the Salahead Ambush in Tipperary. These were Dan Breen, Sean Tracy, Seamus Robinson and Sean Hogan. You might remember these men from podcast number 7, The Rescue at Knocklong. As the big four were on the run, they moved from Tipperary up to Dublin to try and stay out of sight. Now I think it's important just to highlight the differences between the squad and say an ordinary flying column or an ordinary IRA brigade. A lot of the time a flying column were attacking men that they didn't know personally. They were attacking a force of black and tans or auxiliaries or British soldiers that were stationed in their area. Now the squad was much more strict. They didn't attack random policemen or Crown forces in Dublin. Each assassination that was carried out were well researched and planned missions. The squad received precise and direct instructions from GHQ Intelligence Department, in which Michael Collins was director of. The Department of Intelligence was based on 3 Crow Street in Temple Bar. As Vinnie Byrne said in an interview, quote, "We received an order and we carried it out. Whether it was right or wrong, we carried out that order." Now the squad partook in some major events throughout the 2.5-year War of Independence. To stay going chronologically as we're going to go throughout the podcast, right? On the 30th of November 1919, Paddy Daly's section of the squad killed another G-man, Detective John Barton. Detective Barton was another man responsible for identifying Sean McDiarmid in 1916, which resulted in his execution. In Vinnie Byrne's witness statements, he says that he shot him on College Street. He fell down on his side, raised himself up on his right knee and shouted, "Oh God, what did I do to deserve this?" After that, he fired his revolver up the street and died. The next mission by the squad was on the 19th of December 1919, and it's known as the Ashtown Ambush. The objective was to ambush and kill the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, John French. As this was a huge mission and one that had serious consequences if it failed, they needed a large force of men to avoid any mistakes. The full-time squad led by Paddy Daly was joined by the part-time squad led by Mick MacDonald. A 1916 veteran by the name of Martin Savage also insisted on partaking in the ambush, and they were also joined by the Big Four, Seamus Robinson, Dan Breen, Sean Hogan and Sean Tracy. The squad received intelligence that Lord French would be travelling from Roscommon to Dublin by train, and he was expected to arrive at Ashtown Station in Dublin on the 19th of December 1919. That day, the men cycled to Ashtown and waited in Kelly's pub for Lord French to arrive into the area. When they received the signal that there was 2 cars coming into the area, Dan Breen, Tom Keogh and Martin Savage rushed out and they tried to push a cart into the middle of the road to block Lord French's car. Underestimating how heavy the cart was, the first car with Lord French inside got away. The squad and the IRA members expected French to be in the second car and launched an attack on it. A gun battle broke out. Martin Savage was shot and died in Dan Breen's arms. Breen also received a bullet to his leg. The IRA and the squad successfully captured the second car, but it had nothing in it but luggage. The IRA let the driver go and told him that, "We don't shoot prisoners." Throughout 1920, the squad continued to assassinate intelligence officers and police. On the 14th of April 1920, they shot a policeman by the name of Constable Henry Kells on Camden Street. On the 20th of April 1920, they shot a G-man by the name of Detective Lawrence Dalton. On the 15th of June 1920, Captain Percival Lee Wilson, who had abused the 1916 Easter Rising prisoners, was shot dead by the squad in Gorey, County Wexford. The squad are a household name in Irish history, mostly because of what they pulled off during November in 1920. And this, ladies and gents, is where we welcome the infamous Cairo Gang. The Café Cairo on 59 Grafton Street was often frequented by Dublin Castle spies. The funny thing about the name Cairo Gang is, the name was barely ever used by the IRA, or even the British. The exception is Dan Breen, really. In his book My Fight for Irish Freedom, he mentions that Major George Smith had been on service in Egypt and applied for intelligence work in Ireland. He picked 11 men to come over to Ireland with him to seek revenge for his brother's death. His brother was shot by the Cork IRA back in July 1920. Anyways, the name Cairo Gang is confusing. It isn't an official name used anywhere. Dan Breen presumably referred to this group as the Cairo Gang because they used to hang out in Cafe Cairo, and probably not because Major George Smith had come from Egypt. Another place that the Cairo Gang frequented was Kids Buffet near Grafton Street. Funnily enough, this buffet was actually frequented by the IRA intelligence officers as well. The IRA intelligence had a man on the inside called David Nelligan. He worked in Dublin Castle with the British intelligence, but he was actually an IRA supporter. One day in Kids Buffet, David Nelligan introduced some IRA intelligence officers to the British intelligence officers. He just gave them fake names. They discussed Michael Collins and the Dublin IRA. The IRA intelligence officers did such a good job at pretending to be anti-IRA that the British intelligence officers actually even dropped some of the names of their informers. The most crazy story from this whole period comes from IRA intelligence officer Frank Thornton's witness statements. One day in Kids, Frank Thornton, Tom Cullen and Frank Soren were sitting there and a British officer came over and said, quote, "Surely you fellas know these three men, Liam Tobin, Tom Cullen and Frank Thornton. They're Michael Collins' three officers. If you can get these fellas, we'd be able to locate Collins himself." Could you imagine that? They were sitting there while the British officer says your own name to you and wondering where they could find you. They obviously pulled off their fake names pretty well. Now, this all leads up to November 1920, the bloodiest month of the entire 2.5-year guerrilla war. Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence MacSweeney, had just died on hunger strike. The town of Tralee was besieged by Black and Tans and auxiliaries, and they terrorised the local civilians for 10 days. And Kevin Barry was hanged in Mountjoy prison. By November, Dublin was swarming with these British spies, known as the Cairo Gang, and they were on the hunt for Michael Collins. The plan was, in one single morning, the squad would wipe out the entire group. Pierce Baisley remembered that they had previously received a list of names and addresses of these spies. Michael Collins assembled some of the men from the squad and handpicked some of the men from the Dublin IRA battalions, and he put together an incredibly well thought out and concise plan to wipe out this Cairo Gang. On the morning of Sunday the 21st of November 1920, Dublin City awoke to the sound of IRA guns. Most of the assassinations happened in the south side of the city. Lieutenant Henry Anglis was shot and killed on 22 Lower Mount Street by Tom Keogh. Two auxiliaries witnessed the scene. They ran towards their barracks for reinforcements, and they were shot dead too. At 92 Lower Baggot Street, Captain William Frederick Newbury was killed. At 119 Lower Baggot Street, Captain Geoffrey Thomas Bagley was killed. At 28 Earlsford Terrace, Sergeant John J. Fitzgerald was killed. At 117 Morehampton Road, Lieutenant Donald Lewis MacLean and Thomas Smith were killed. At 38 Upper Mount Street, Lieutenant Peter Ames and Captain George Bennett were killed. At 28 and 29 Upper Pembroke Road, 6 more spies were shot. 3 lived, 3 died. At Gresham Hotel, in the north side, Captain Patrick McCormick and Leonard Wilde were shot dead. Altogether, they killed 14 men and 1 died later. The majority of the assassinations were carried out in one swoop at 9 o'clock that morning, when the men were still in bed. Michael Collins said afterwards, quote, "By their destruction, the very air is made sweeter. For myself, my conscience is clear. There is no crime in detecting and destroying in wartime the spy and the informer. They have destroyed without trial. I paid them back in their own coin." And this ends today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed this one, guys. It's mad. The amount of assassinations and ambushes that the squad were involved in and how incredibly competent these men were is actually crazy. And there's a lot more to it than this. It goes on further, but this, I suppose, the day of Bloody Sunday, or the morning of Bloody Sunday, I should say, is what made them a household name in Irish history. Even though they've done so much throughout the 2.5 years, I feel like that's what most people know them for. But yeah, it's absolutely crazy. Most of the stuff I study is generally more aimed at flying columns and IRA battalions and brigades from more rural areas, we'll say. But when you start studying the 12 Apostles or the squad, It's absolutely incredible. How competent these men were is unbelievable for the time. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast, guys. I'll definitely do a part 2 on the squad for sure. But if you want early access to these podcasts, you can sign up to my Patreon. And other than that, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks a million for joining in. Good luck.